that it's really neat to see and to be able to now offer like such a premium product to the more of a grassroots guy, whereas 10, 12 years ago, that would just never, ever even work, you know?
Welcome to the HPA Tuned In podcast. I'm Andre, your host, and in this episode, we're joined by Ryan from Rywire. Ryan is a longtime friend of High Performance Academy and, in fact, was instrumental in the first generation of our wiring fundamentals course. Our wiring is obviously his game, and we learn from Ryan how he first got involved in cars, why he gravitated towards the Honda brand, where Rywire is best known, and then how he went from offering small adapter harnesses and built up a brand that now offers shelf stock harnesses for all manner of cars, not just Hondas anymore, as well as producing one-off bespoke professional motorsport level harnesses for all manner of race and show cars. Now, he has built a very successful business in what is a tricky industry. So we also dive into the business aspect of that, how he focuses on developing the products and how he balances building one-off harnesses with his production run harnesses for both Rywire as well as white label projects for others. Before we get into our chat with Ryan, for those who are joining us for the first time on the Tuned In podcast, High Performance Academy is an online training school. We specialize in teaching people how to build quality, reliable wiring harnesses. We also cover engine tuning, engine building, race driver education, race car setup, data analysis, just to name a few of the topics. You can find a complete list of our courses at hpacademy.com/courses. But relevant to today's topic is our wiring courses. This starts with our wiring fundamentals course, which I recently just mentioned. This teaches you the fundamentals of wiring as it applies to the automotive sense. And I think I've seen over my career a lot of enthusiasts who are very skilled and very smart people shy away from taking on even basic wiring jobs on their cars because they don't understand how a circuit works. They don't understand current, resistance, voltage. So this course starts with those fundamentals, teaches you the basics. You'll learn how a circuit works, how to protect it with fusing, how relays work, just to name a few aspects. Moving on from there, we have our practical club level harness construction course, which teaches you how to build quality, reliable harnesses. And we're talking here about cost-effective solutions for club level cars. So nothing that is going to break the bank. You're not going to see Autosport connectors in this course. And to be honest, most at the club level definitely don't need that. So this is going to teach you how to design, document, and build a reliable quality harness. Then, if you do want to go further, we also have our practical professional level motorsport wiring harness course, which is for those of you who want to learn the skills of concentric twisting, how to work with circular mil-spec or Autosport connectors. You'll learn about the crimp tools that are involved. You'll learn how to work with DR25 sheathing, heat molded boots and transitions, and how to seal these with resin. Again, just to name a few of those topics. Both of our practical courses also include worked examples where you can watch the process being applied from start to finish, talking about that process. Again, it can be a little daunting when you come to your first wiring job, knowing what to do first and how to progress. And what we've done with both of those courses is provided a step-by-step process. By doing this, each of the steps in the process is relatively quick and easy to complete, and it makes sure that you get the right result and don't overlook any steps along the way. We'll put a link to those 3 courses in the show notes, and as an HPA Tuned In listener, you can use the coupon code podcast75. That's going to get you $75 off the purchase of your very first HPA course. Again, there's a link in the description for that coupon code. All right, enough with our introduction. Let's get into our chat with Ryan now. All right, welcome to the podcast, Ryan. Thanks for joining us today. You're really well known as a Honda guy through and through, and obviously for your wiring harnesses, which is one of the key topics we're going to be dealing with today. I want to start, though, at the beginning. How did you get involved with cars in the first place, and why did it happen to be that it was the Honda brand?
Well, my family was actually always a Honda family. There's a lot of people that, surround themselves by like a Toyota family, for example. Well, we happen to be a Honda family, and everybody in my family actually had SIs. So CRX SI, Prelude SI. It was always like the sporty ones, for example. And it's kind of cool because my uncle was actually really into it. He had a CRX SI, and he took me to a CRX meet called CR Expo, and that was actually at Laguna Seca. And that was kind of my first time meeting a lot of enthusiasts around that specific car. I had purchased a first gen CRX because I wasn't really, I guess didn't have the funds to buy a second gen, and I always kind of aspired to have a second gen. Eventually, I sold that car and upgraded to the second gen. My uncle was, sharing a lot of info with me about, you could do a B16 swap and you could do these things, and this is available in Japan. And I don't know, it was really exciting and different and cool. And I was, about getting my driver's license around 16 years old, and that just kind of opened the door to automotive and kind of took me away from things like skateboarding and living in Monterey. There was a lot of golf, so I was doing a lot of like activities with golfing and different sports, and that really just kind of pushed me into being a car guy now instead of like your typical Monterey golfer, I guess you could say, or skateboarder.
I
So
must admit, I've never really seen the attraction of chasing a little white ball around a golf course. Cars
yep.
definitely a little bit more adrenaline involved, so I totally get that. At this time, so that CRX, you just said 16 years old, give or take, and getting your driver's license, is that the first car you ended up with?
Yeah, first car I ended up with was a CRX, and then I think I ended up with like maybe seven more after that, various different ones and projects. And so I mean, it's a disease, I guess you could say. There's definitely a lot of cars that excite me, but that was always one that I could afford. I knew I could modify and I could like make it my own.
Sure. I think that's obviously the attraction for most of us as enthusiasts is not buying a showroom stock car and driving it. That's great. I mean, it'll get you from A to B, but it goes a lot deeper, and the ability to modify the car and make it your own, add that personalization, that's sort of really what most of us are in the industry for. So at what point did you start developing that car and making changes and building the skills of actually modifying cars as opposed to just driving them from place to place?
Right. So the first gen car was just like a real quick thing. I just kind of wanted something for transportation that I could modify, and realized really quick that, it was the carbureted version, and I was just not really excited on doing that one. I kept seeing my uncles, and I'm like, I got to get, a second gen 88 to 91. So once I got that, I just started doing little things, just kind of influenced by people around me and things, like, oh, put an air intake and like small stuff. But I actually started to go to college at Monterey Peninsula College, and that was, like the local kind of starter college for me before I went to San Jose. And there was a technician there. There was actually he was a Honda tech, and he was like offered a kind of like a gateway course where you just learn the basics, and then he had kind of a more advanced course. So I took a course with him, and I learned a little bit about cars, how to change oil and stuff, and I thought, this is kind of cool. I can implement this into my own car. I can bring my own car to the shop and I can work on it. So the next year I took a course with him, and he was actually like, he was a Honda technician, and he said, listen, I could tell you're really passionate about this. How about instead of doing any book work, you go to Los Angeles, because I told him about this. Go to LA, pick up a B16 engine, and your basically chore for the course is to get it running. So that was a huge like kickstart for me, where I had this Honda technician that was my teacher that could kind of like, you know, aid me through the process of doing this engine swap. So when you do that engine swap to the car I had, it was an SI, you have to add like 4 wires for VTEC. Well, it's really VTEC pressure, knock sensor, and then the secondary O2 when you're running the OBD0 like original computer. So that was the hardest part for me, to be honest, was to try to figure out how you wire in the 4 wires, where they specifically go, and then like little tricks and things that I didn't understand, I was able to kind of implement into a summer job, and that was to go to the junkyard, grab little connectors, and build this little VTEC sub loom, to just pay some bills, and just sell this stuff on eBay, make a few bucks. That was kind of the gateway into Rywire. And that was also the gateway into just like knowing how to work on cars, is just forcing myself to do engine swaps.
All right, let's just stop there and just sort of unpack a bit of that. It sounds like
Sure.
the ideal course, you're basically attending a school and learning how to engine swap. I mean, I've never heard of that before. That sounds absolutely perfect, particularly ideal given where you've ended up. I don't know what era this is, but obviously these days, if you want to do almost any Honda engine swap, you just about download a PDF from one of 100 different sources telling you exactly what steps to take. It's such a well-trodden path.
Right.
Was that the situation when you did that B swap, or was it really the information coming from your Honda Tech teacher that aided? Basically, what I'm saying is, how hard was it back then? Were you sort of paving your own way?
It was hard enough that there wasn't any very good like how-tos, for example. So I actually created a how-to. I made a website that's, was very simple, but it was my username on one of the forums, and it was like dropped CRXSI because I only had like suspension, I guess, when I signed up for the account. So I made a website, and it was really simple, and it was just like, this is how I did my engine swap. So I included pictures and like what axles I would use, for example, or what mounts you could use. And at the time, the main key was you could get a mount kit. So Hossport was developing a mount kit. Maybe one other company or so was developing a mount kit. So I went with a Hossport mount kit, and everything else was just kind of like gathering the right sort of junkyard parts, or the right year bracket, or the right year radiator hose or something like that. I just kind of use like reasoning. So it's like, well, if this car was in Japan and it was fitted with this engine, what's different? Like, is the radiator slightly smaller? Oh, well, that's because it was a D series and this is a B. It's slightly bigger engine, double cam engine with VTEC. Okay, that would make sense. So how do I solve this like one size to another reducer, or you know what I mean? So I kind of just used a lot of logic and reasoning skills to figure out how this worked. My Honda technician teacher, his name was Will. Will like knew a lot about the cars, but he didn't know how to do like swaps, right? But he kind of told me, "Listen, we'll figure it out. It's not that big of a deal. We'll get through it." And I really wasn't scared. So that was the cool thing, was that I wasn't scared to just do like a deep dive. I knew that I had like him as kind of a backup plan, but everything just kind of works out, you know what I mean? So I just figured it out with different skills, and got it going. I didn't really have to like fabricate too much. It's not the hardest swap in the world. So
I mean, as I kind of alluded to, obviously as time's gone by, these swaps have become, I would say, almost increasingly easier. And there's so much sort of like Hossport, as you mentioned, with the mount kits, literally just make it so easy to do these swaps. But the mechanical side of things, obviously that's one aspect of it, and it sounds like you're obviously pretty skilled in that side of things as well. The part that I've seen through sort of 20 odd years in the industry, and probably in fairness, back in my earlier days, I was guilty of this. I see so many enthusiasts that are prepared to sort of get stuck in and get their hands dirty and actually physically go through the mechanical aspects of an engine swap, sometimes fabrication, just about anything. And then where they come unstuck, where they really strike problems, is when it comes to the wiring aspect to actually get these up and running. So again, how was that different for you? I'm guessing at this point you haven't got the skill set that you've got these days in terms of custom wiring. Yeah, so how did you sort of overcome that fear and get it done?
Well, okay, so the first car was an SI, so it wasn't the dual point version. That's a little bit more complicated. So I was able to just kind of, I actually did download wiring diagrams for the ECUs because I knew they were slightly different. I didn't know exactly what I was in for, and I actually found a couple things that varied, and a lot of people got stuck on. So what kind of you're talking about is like, the normal enthusiast would be able to kind of bolt it all together, but then they would get stuck in the wiring. And I actually found out that the Japanese O2 sensor, for example, our US primary sensor, which we only had one, they had a primary and a secondary, but the connectors were actually flip-flopped. So what that meant is all these enthusiasts were hooking up just one O2 sensor with that Japanese computer, and the car would kind of bog and hesitate and stuff like that. And the air fuel ratio was off because it's basically reading a single sensor in the wrong cylinders, because there's two single wire O2s, and they're for like basically one exhaust runner and the second exhaust runner, and it's very specific on which one it's firing on. So
Okay.
you're basically, this normal guy is just going to go, oh well, you don't really need them, and you just kind of hook it up both to one, or you like, it's just not the right way to do it. As you're an engine tuner, all these things are running through your mind going, well, wait a minute, like if that cylinder is thinking it's the other cylinder, then you're completely firing at 180 off, thinking that the air, checking the air fuel mixture wrong, everything that goes along with that. So I realized, I'm like, well, these two positions on the ECU, this cylinder from the factory runs into these two cylinders, or sorry, this wire is monitoring these two cylinders. So I actually just tried it, and I just snipped off the wire and just flip-flopped it. The car instantly ran better. And
Yeah.
obviously why? Because it's monitoring the proper cylinder banks. So that was something that I just kind of like never liked about the swap, is it always bogged and hesitated because the air fuel was always off. And I was able to actually figure that out, and that was super early on, and I was actually able to show that to enthusiasts and teach them that like this is the proper way to do it. And everybody was just like, oh my god, you fixed my car. Like, I actually like this B16 now, where before the drivability was so poor, right?
It's interesting you say that, because this is probably something that should be a lot easier to get right. It's not as subtle as what you're talking about, but
Mm-hmm.
the LS swaps, obviously there's 100 million of those all around the world, and I've seen more than a handful now come through the door to go on the dyno, and the person who's done the installation, obviously with those you can buy off the shelf harnesses to wire everything up, makes it nice and easy. But
Sure.
the trap I've seen people fall into is wiring or connecting the wrong bank O2 sensor. And of
Mm.
course what happens then is the ECU, just like you're saying, essentially is monitoring bank 1,
Mm-hmm.
but it's actually bank 2. So you end up with the trims. One will go massively positive to the
Yeah.
plus 25 limit. The other one goes the other way, and you've got
Yeah.
an engine that barely runs. So yeah, all of the sensors do need to be hooked up correctly for sure. Otherwise, you're going to end up with really horrible running, exactly like you're experiencing. At what point did you sort of get to a situation where you thought, hey, you know what, I'm actually pretty good at this. I can make a go of this and actually create a business around it?
Probably around 2003 to 2004. I think I did this swap maybe closer to like 99 or 2000, and I was just kind of, like I said, I was selling these little simple VTech wiring harnesses, and everybody was really happy with them. I mean, not just because it's a 4-wire harness and it's super easy, but I was actually explaining. I had good information on, like, you hook it up, but then you need to flip around these O2s, and then everybody was so happy with the way that their B16s were running after that. Then I started dabbling with the OBD1 conversion. So this was obviously a computer that you can throw a different map on, and as you start doing upgrades with these kind of things, maybe you want to run a camshaft or a header, and that's all going to change the tune up, right? So being able to chip the computers early on, and at least just getting them a little bit better than they were from the factory, that was kind of the natural progression. So I would say at the point where I started actually purchasing these ECU patch harnesses from a company that I actually later ended up buying, which is JKOBD, if some people might remember that, way back in the day. There was a guy named Jason, and he was going to the junkyard, and he was making little patch harnesses to go OBD1. And I was making the dual point to multi-point conversion harnesses. People would send me their dual point harness. I would convert it to the SI specs, and I would do all the little things that people miss. Like, the throttle position sensors actually rotated the opposite direction, so you have to switch the two wires, so it actually will go from like 5 to 0, 0 to 5. It actually, the poles were flipped because the throttle position blade was the opposite direction. So you had to know to flip the two wires and stuff like that people didn't really get right the first time.
Stuff that's maybe not that obvious
It's
unless you're pretty deep in the weeds with it.
exactly, especially if you're not like looking at the engines very closely and you don't catch that something like that's off, or you don't have the reasoning ability to go, well, wait a minute, if that position sensor is rotated the opposite direction, wouldn't it be rotating backwards and giving opposite information to the ECU. So things like that, I was working on and dialing in, and I just kind of progressed very organically, and it started turning into, okay, well, let me make a website, let me offer this service. And then my friend Jason, when he actually decided to up and kind of, he had to stop his company because it would be a conflict of interest. He was working with Honda directly, and he was actually doing the factory tune-ups and calibrations on some of the early 2000 cars. So like, our US TSX model car, he actually built that calibration and he was doing the factory tuning. So
Okay.
he offered to have me basically as his best customer at the time, to buy him out and to learn his skills. And then we started manufacturing the ECU jumper, the sub harnesses that would go along with it, and then also the dual point conversions. And then it was just kind of an organic growth from one product to the next, and we were working our way up the Honda ladder, if you will, of the different wiring looms and solutions.
You've just mentioned a couple of times there dual point to multi-point, and I'm not I'm not a Honda specialist. I'm guessing you're talking there about dual point fuel injection versus a full sequential system, essentially. So batch fire with 2 injection points.
Exactly. So in the United States only, I don't think that there's much of this model available in other parts of the world, but not really sure exactly why Honda did it this way, but they just have a 2 fuel injector system, and there's a way that you can pretty easily configure it to the 4 sequential injection. So,
Okay.
yep.
Which obviously on a 4-cylinder engine, anything performance orientated, multi-point sequential injection is the only way we really want to do it.
Of course, yeah.
All right, so you've purchased this company making these adapter harnesses, and again, other than those changes we've just talked about, that adapter harness, the key benefit there is it allows you to run an ECU that is then to at least some degree programmable. Yeah, there was sort of a shift in this as well. This, I'm guessing, if I've got my eras correct, is probably about the time we're sort of starting to see more flexibility and availability in full programmable ECUs, some of them being plug and play as well. So how did that sort of change your direction? Is that sort of coming through at that same time, or are the Honda crew are still really keen on these OBD1 ECUs?
Yeah, the Honda guys were still really, like you said, really keen on the OBD1. They kind of thought that as being like the end all be all, and not many people were graduating to full standalone at that time. So that was just like not really our big market. You got to kind of chase the customers. You got to do what everybody wants. You can't just be like, we're going to not do it this way, and we're only going to do these like, new brand Motec kind of things, or AEM Series 2 or whatever was available at the time. We were just stuck with doing what everybody wanted to see. Everybody was using the chip OBD1 computers, and that's what it was for a really long time. Eventually, AEM started with their plug and play solution, and I think that's what really got a lot of people's feet wet with a standalone system, because they offered these like plug and play boards where it's this standalone board that may have knock control, and then they just kind of like integrate that onto a jumper board and sandwich 2 plates together, and then now you got like an OBD1 header, and you could plug that in as a solution instead of doing your like chipped quote unquote ECUs.
It's also worth mentioning, and I see this more with the Honda brand, I've tuned a lot of them over the years, is that a standalone isn't necessary in every single instance. I mean, these days, because of the number of standalones available, we see people sort of just choosing one because they think they need it. But I mean, if you've got a basic B16A, for example, maybe with the obligatory intake headers and an exhaust system, you're going to be able to do a really good job of tuning that on, a chipped ECU. Yes, there's some intricacies around that, but on the other hand, if you're going to run a ported head, a set of aggressive cams, ITBs, or maybe you're going to go turbo or supercharger, well, that's a different deal. And while yes, you could make one of those run on a chipped ECU, at that point, I'd be sort of starting to gravitate more towards the standalone for the flexibility and control that offers. So, yeah. The price point as well for a standalone is significantly different than a chipped OBD1 ECU. So that's another factor we need to keep in mind as well. That it's everyone's got a budget, correct?
Exactly. And to be honest, a lot of my market that I was, dealing with at that point in time, early in my career, like $1,000 for a full system, even with a wiring harness, would be way too out of somebody's budget. So, it was just slow organic growth, and I was doing these wiring looms for these people at everybody else's pace. And it wasn't until the last, 10 or so years where you started seeing these really advanced systems starting to develop. So, I mean, I've been doing this for a long time. So, like, I've really seen it all. But it's pretty awesome to see the ability of some of these standalone systems now, and the fact that you can, you know, get a guy into a package because, like maybe a lot of people have multiple cars now, and it's like, oh, this car I'm running fuel tech, and I really like the way that fuel tech works, and I want to implement that system onto this Honda project that I'm starting to use. So it's one of those things where it's like they're using it because now they're familiar with that system, and the ECU companies have done such a good job marketing all the things you could do with these systems. Like yourself, for example, you're marketing all these great systems, and now you can do electronic throttle body, and you can have all these different half bridge controls, and there's so many things that you could do with motorsport level stuff, and a lot of these guys are actually using it in street cars, and it's really neat to see and to be able to now offer like such a premium product to the more of a grassroots guy, whereas 10, 12 years ago that would just never ever even work.
Yeah, and there's been a massive evolution in the time that I've been involved, and obviously likewise yourself. And I think one of the drivers, and we just talked about the standalone versus OBD1, and one of the drivers I think now that sort of come through is, well, yes, obviously there's still people running stock unmodified engines. There's more and more people now, doing a K-swap with a turbo and intending to produce 800 horsepower, and that's not considered crazy these days. And that's sort of a build with all of the other motorsport functionality that you would probably naturally expect to incorporate. That really does lend itself more towards one of the higher end aftermarket standalones than trying to get by with a Honda calibration. So that's sort of a different direction the market's taken. Coming back to your skill set, I mean, what we're talking about here with producing patch harnesses and then full harnesses, obviously the skills involved are very different than adding VTEC into a non-VTEC vehicle back in the day. How did you develop your skills further as you got more involved in harness design and construction?
Well, I think that a lot of clients that were close to me, like my friends at a friend level, because last thing I would want to do is try to build this elaborate wiring loom for a race car that I can't validate that it's going to work, right? So what I started doing was, kind of got with the right people that are interested in, just kind of trying to either take their race car to the next level, or just take their street car to something that's a little bit more like crazy just to do it. And I mean, I'm guilty of that too. There's projects that I was doing myself, and I was like, I want to put a really nice ECU on here so I can learn and I can strategize, and sometimes you can't find that. Maybe you have this, you aspire to do something that's kind of next level, but there's nobody there to just say, listen, you can try it on my car, right? So I've been forced to, for example, I really saw the need and desire to try to do a electronic throttle controlled ITB system. And this was back in like 2012 era. I'm not exactly sure what year it was, but I just kind of saw, oh man, these ECUs can do drive-by-wire, and it'd be really cool to make the ITB throttles electronic. And that was something that I was like, you could get great reliability, drivability, the idle's going to be better, like all these things are going to be better. And finding somebody to actually do it, well, I just did it myself, right? So sometimes it was clients that were really willing to let me experiment on their cars and we try it, or I just try to build something myself.
I'm definitely a big fan of, where possible, having your own project cars, and I know that you've got and have had a number over the years, but project cars where you can sort of dive deep into some of these details, because often if you're doing work for customers, obviously what you can do is really driven by what the customer wants. And obviously everything has a budget, like I've already mentioned as well. So you can't do some of the more crazy stuff that you really want to do. The nice aspect of doing it on your own stuff is, let's be honest, not everything works out smoothly and goes perfectly. So, if it's your own car, well, that gives you the flexibility. You're not frustrating a customer because it hasn't worked out perfectly, and it gives you the opportunity to iron those bugs out, expand your own knowledge, and then once you've got it dialed in, then you've got that next little product or understanding of a feature that then you can implement into customers' cars when the time comes. So it obviously can't always be done that way. If you've got some really understanding, good friends who are customers, happy days, that's even better. You can kind of, expand your knowledge on their vehicles as well. Where I see a lot of, I'd probably more relate this to the tuning industry, a lot of people come unstuck or workshops come unstuck is where they are experimenting and doing things for the first time that's maybe above their pay grade and their knowledge, and they're doing that on customers' cars. And unfortunately, more often than not, that ends about as well as you could probably expect.
Sometimes there's clients that like want to push you, hey, I saw you do this, but I want to do it like that. And, this is a little bit more, even the bar is raised even higher. And, I really, over the years, it's a hard balance, right? But sometimes you can get with a client that is very willing and open, and maybe even they have a little bit of knowledge, and you're just like a fill point for them. Like, they're trying to do this really crazy strategy with all this different stuff and something that's really outside of the norm. And you're just there to kind of like build a loom and get them to where they need to be, and then they can kind of run with it. So I've had some really, really good clients that have actually taught me a lot, and then in turn teach themselves a lot. And then we both get to grow, knowing and understanding those clients, so you don't get put into a situation where they expect you to bail them out. That's really the difficulty. But I've had some really great clients in the past, and we've done some pretty awesome and amazing things that are, I think, ahead of the time, because I'm working with them and I'm kind of allowing them to get to the position that they're trying to get to, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what I see with a lot of people is that they'll develop a new skill set and they'll go to a certain point and then kind of plateau, and they kind of, I guess for want of a better term, they get comfortable with what they're doing, the knowledge that they need in order to do that, and they don't want to progress anymore. And you could liken that to the point where you're making those patch harnesses. You could have probably just stuck at that point and not progressed, but obviously you had that desire to build your knowledge, stretch yourself, push yourself beyond the limits you currently had, and expand to what Rywire is today. So kudos to you for doing that. On that note, can you maybe give us a bit of an overview of what the Rywire operation looks like today, premises, staff, what you're actually producing and offering in terms of services and products?
Yeah, totally. So at the moment, at this time, we have a immediate staff of just 4 of us. So it's myself and 3 employees, and we do in-house builds where we're doing development and learning. So a lot of those are my personal vehicles, and I try to take time out of my day to develop. And right now, I'm doing a lot of electric vehicle development. So I'm just experimenting and learning EV stuff, and doing certain clients that are willing to grow with me, like I was mentioning before. For example, we did a project with AEM, and it was a full EV setup, and they are very knowledgeable with their VCU control and all these different things. And I was able to kind of design a wiring loom with them, and then we were able to sort out any kinks, and then everybody was super happy. We met the deadline. So I've been doing a lot of projects like that, hands-on and stuff, myself personally. And then we have another employee, Ryan Durr, and he focuses a lot on the custom looms. So he's building motorsport level looms, custom construction. A lot of them are concentrically twisted, nicer high-end terminations with autosport or mil-spec connectors, just really what the client needs, like what level they need to be on with their build. And I spend the other part of my day building on paper a lot of the wiring looms. So design in different mostly just IO and where wires need to end up, connectors, ordering of stuff for these one-off projects. And then we have another couple other guys. David's basically the sales manager. So what he's doing is he is taking orders, and then we have Dan that does all the turn 14 stuff. So we have all these looms that I've developed over the years, and these part numbers now are available for purchase, and you can purchase these looms from turn 14. So Dan's constantly filling the orders for turn, managing turn's account, making sure that all those big boxes of parts are getting shipped and materials are getting ordered, and we are doing a lot of manufacturing of these looms that we can call our quote unquote shelf harnesses. And the shelf harnesses have actually kind of leveled up to a more of a motorsport environment with the different ECUs, a lot of the Tyco plugs, we can call them the Motec plugs. So what we've done is we've offered the Cyvex, Mtron, Haltech, Motec, the 100 series, the Gold Box, the M series, basically all the ECUs that are popular at this time, we can support with our Honda level harnesses. We're also starting to work on a little bit more like the GM stuff, and then we're doing Toyota, Mazda, basically all the heavy hitter engines, your LSs, your 2Js, your rotary stuff like your 13 and 20Bs and stuff like that. So there's a lot of opportunity there, and we're just kind of doing what we can, but I'm always kind of developing the new stuff and trying to look to the future to see what's next, So that's kind of how we run the shop. And we have manufacturing in a company near Los Angeles. So everything is made very close by. So I'm able to travel and make sure that all of my designs, because these are all my designs, and they are manufactured at a grand scale, because I just can't, I can't have 50 employees just in the back of the shop building wiring looms. It's just not really feasible. So
let's just stop you there, and we'll dive into a bit of this, because there's been a lot of information you've just provided. So if I'm hearing this right, we could basically split your business into, at least in the wiring level, two parts. You've got the bespoke, custom, one-off style designs, which sounds like you and Ryan Ryan Durr are involved with, and then you've got these, what you've referred to as the shelf stock harnesses, which I think is probably where you maybe originally were best known for, sort of the hidden tucked harnesses for the Honda, for the show scene, where essentially you can almost make the wiring completely vanish. But now, as you were saying there, you've got the flexibility to do engine swaps and a wide range of different ECUs within those shelf stock harnesses. And those ones are you've basically designed them, built them, validated them, and then you're getting those built off-site in quantity. That's correct?
Correct. Yeah, that way we can have stuff in stock. And I mean, there's times where Turn 14 will order, 150 looms in a single purchase order. So there's no way that we'd be working all year to build those looms. So we have hired help.
Absolutely. No, it makes perfect sense, and just allows you the flexibility there, of course, to scale without, as you mentioned, taking on 50 employees and all of the implications that involves personally. Yeah. I'm interested, though, with these shelf stock harnesses, because what you're saying there, I could understand if you offered this harness that was for X engine in a given chassis with a specific ECU and this sensor package, happy days. We go and make 150 of those. They're all the same, and we know exactly what we're getting. It sounds like you're adding a huge layer of complexity, although great flexibility to the end user, when you can say, I want this harness, it's going to be for this chassis, it's got a Mtron KV8 ECU, I want a coolant pressure sensor. Actually, I don't know if that's something you offer, but the ability to sort of, one thing I would say is, maybe you've got a B series and you've got rid of the distributor and you've gone to a coil-on plug. So there's tick boxes you've got on your website or drop-down menus you can choose. So what's the lead time that then creates in terms of, obviously, your number of part numbers for harnesses massively expands. Yeah, yes. Can you tell us how that all works?
Okay, so that is the number one most difficult part. You've like nailed it on the head. That's why I think a lot of these guys can't grow their businesses to maybe the place that I'm at, is because it's hard to fathom. Okay, how can I make one wiring harness suit every application? So that's where I've spent a lot of time just racking my brain. How do you do that? And that's probably the most difficult, single-handedly the most difficult part, where I spend a lot of time revising and making. I'm projecting. So I've done so many custom or customized wiring harnesses that I know what, let's say, 90% of people are going to use when they have, let's say you have a 2JZ and you have a AEM Infinity, because that's a local company. AEM's right down the street. 2JZ is actually their most popular engine supporting the AEM Infinity ECU. So let's just go there, right? I know that AEM is going to sell. Most of my AEMs are going to be for Honda, because I'm Rywire and that's what they associate me with. But I know, because AEM has told me, that the most number one engine they support is 2J. So I go, okay, let's make a 2J AEM Infinity. And then I go, okay, what ignition coil packs are going to be the most readily available? Or what's going to be something where it's going to be a bad decision, like waste spark 3 coil system? Probably not for most people if they're going to be running a standalone, right? So I go, okay, let's go sequential. But then what ignition coil packs are the most popular for the 2J engine? You have the GTR, you have IGN-1As. There's different ways to do that. There's different ways to skin that cat. And as you know, you have an ignition coil driver that needs to be thought of, right? Okay, how you're going to be driving those coils with the factory coils, but then you may have a smart coil that has an internal igniter, so you don't need an ignition box for it, right? So you have to figure out a way, and this is just for the ignition system. You have to figure out a way where you can potentially, do I want to wire IGN-1A coils? Like, there's 5 wires on those, and 3 of them are grounds, but they go to different places, and there's a way to do it right, and then there's a way to like not really do it right. So I can build in, let's say, for example, those 5-wire ignition coils, they all common have the signal wire that goes straight to the ECU for the driver, right? They have a ground that goes to the head, and then they have a 12-volt switched power wire. That's common for all the smart coils, as well as the IGN-1A coils. But the IGN-1A coils also have a 0-volt reference wire that runs to the ECU, but that could be a very small wire. It can be shared, right? And then it also has another ground wire that you would potentially probably want to send to either a different spot on the chassis or directly to the battery negative in an ideal situation, right? So what can I do? I could build something where there's a breakaway, for example, right? You have a Deutsch connector, you break it away. Now you're trying to size that connector properly, have different possible plug and play add-ons. How do you then eliminate the driver, and loop all those wires together so you can convert smart coil to the dumb coil factory sequential, right? So there's all these different ways to just skin the cat on the ignition system, right? So I just basically think ahead and go, okay, what are the top coils I'm going to use? Let's support 3 of them, and let's figure out ways where we can build in stuff like, let's say, that sensor ground wire, that 0-volt reference, to maybe just not be terminated every time, but on a certain coil application, it'll have a wire that we can do a quick addition to, and then it can then be plug and play.
So you've got that wire sitting there in the harness for every harness, but It's only used when you're running the IGN-1A coil packs.
Correct. So it's things like that you can only really know by doing, and you only have the data when you're forced to basically do all these wiring looms, and you could look back and go, okay, how many IGN-1A did we do? All right, how many GTR? How many sequential coil packs did we do? And then we kind of decide, when we're doing that manufacturing run, if you will, on this one, we would basically go, okay, well, we did 8 out of 10 was, let's say, the factory ignition coils, okay? And then the 2 out of 10, one of them is a GTR, one of them is an IGN-1A. Like, that might not be accurate. That might have been like 3 or 4 years ago accurate, but at least I would get a head start that way. And then what we could do in-house is we can make all those adjustments. We can validate the harness, and then we can then send it to the customer. And depending on workload, like all that could actually be done in just maybe like 2 days.
Sure. So you've got the ability then to make revisions to your harness once you've actually built revision one, sent it to market, and basically seen what the customer is actually needing. Then you can revise based on that sort of feedback. That's what you're telling me.
Yeah, and sometimes I go, well, studies have shown, quote unquote, that a lot of these guys are using this injector or this coil or whatever it is, and then it kind of like, wow, you realize, oh wow, in the last like 50 harnesses we hardly did any of that. So maybe like next batch we'll put on instead of using like a factory Denso injector, maybe we'll do like an EV14 Bosch injector because the market kind of changes and sways. So like the next batch, we could maybe start there. And then if we have to like do some surgery and snip off those injectors and put the other ones on, we can allow some space on our build and show, like a little extra wire. So if we do have to service and get in there and change it, that, it'll still be a seamless install. Stuff won't be short. You would never even know that stuff was adjusted. So that's the way that we've been doing it, at least, and really works well for us.
Makes perfect sense. I'm glad that you brought up the coil situation because dumb versus smart coils, and particularly those IGN-1A coils, which are so popular, particularly with the high output, big boost turbo engines, are quite specific in their wiring requirements. When you're talking about injectors, I mean, length of the run to the injector notwithstanding, I mean, it's reasonably easy to terminate in a different connector. At the end of the day, there are 12 volts in a driver signal, so no big challenges there. What about a sensor package? Because obviously every engine has its required sensors, maybe the engine speed and position, maybe cam position, throttle position, map sensors, etc. But then there's those above and beyond where, maybe I mentioned earlier a coolant pressure sensor, for example, which wouldn't be a standard inclusion. And when we get deep into that, there's millions of different sensors we may choose to incorporate. Do you use just a conventional sort of Dirtsch breakout connector there that can have another loom harness added onto it for those sorts of sensors, or how do you deal with that?
Exactly. That's exactly how we do it. So we lately we've been populating maybe like a 12-pin DTM, and we've kind of made them multi-purpose. So let's say, for example, that we're building one of our looms that are more set up for like a Motec EC or a full standalone, and maybe something that has like a lambda to can setup, where we would, for example, you could do a multi-purposed loom where you could have a twisted pair that could be used as a CAN bus for like a lambda to can mounted in the engine bay, for example, like a powered can, right? But if you're not using that, maybe you want to use a drive-by-wire accelerator pedal, or maybe those could be the like what you were saying, just like a standard pressure sensor. So we end up just like repurposing things, but because we've done it so much, we're like, okay, let's just make this like a CAN bus. And then if somebody doesn't have that kind of a lambda configuration, then we can add that to a coolant pressure, or it can be something to do with a drive-by-wire motor or whatever the case may be. But like we basically just stack in as much stuff as we possibly can with the idea of being able to repin and change things on the fly before we send it out to the customer. So that's a strategy with our expansion plugs.
Yeah, it's smart. I mean, the one that you've mentioned there as well, the CAN bus is quite specific because that pair, as you mentioned, it has to be a twisted pair for your CAN bus. So, yeah, you can use those for anything else you want if it's a twisted pair and you don't have a CAN unit in the engine bay. But if you went the other way around and didn't incorporate a twisted pair into that harness from the get-go and you wanted to run a lambda to CAN unit, you've got no option, correct?
Right, exactly. And yeah, and the only way that I would know to do that is just experimental, and you learn by doing. It's just like tuning a car, there's things that you can project ahead of time and go, okay, well, if I raise the idle, that it's going to increase timing or something like that. You know that there's an effect that's about to happen before you even do it. So you may as well just set yourself up and throw these wires and put these wires in, and then you can kind of like deal with it after, and you'll already be set up for something when you cross that bridge, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about pass-through connectors for bulkheads, because this is something we get asked a lot about in our webinars. What are our options? And I mean, obviously, the option really does come down to budget as well. At the top of the heap, we've got the likes of Autosport connectors, which add cost for the connector halves and the contacts, but also, they're obviously going to add a time element to actually pinning them out. And at the cheaper end, well, we could do it the way an OE does it and just run the harness uncut through a bulkhead grommet. So do you offer that same sort of optionality with those shelf stock harnesses?
Yeah, I try with those shelf harnesses. I try to kind of stay away from the bulkhead connectors. And the main reason, to be honest, is because the wire counts start to exceed the 61 pin typical mil spec or Autosport pinout. So one big problem is, we get a lot of clients that are like, oh, can you add some kind of a firewall bulkhead to this, whether it be a mil spec style or Autosport, et cetera, et cetera. They want something. And unfortunately, when we start exceeding 61 pins, if we're just under, or if we're just over 61, we can do it, because you can group a few like sources, and you can have, all your 5 volts maybe join, and as long as you can properly get your crimp splice in a comfortable spot for the boot, then you can scale that down from, let's say, a 65 pin down to a 61 pin pretty relatively easily, right? If you're exceeding, let's say we're at like an 80 wire count, a lot of clients are just like, oh, we'll just put 2 mil spec connectors. But as you know, since you've built harnesses before, it's not quite that easy. It's really hard to just break out a loom and then have it pass through 2, and then have it go through properly without it looking upset or just fitting like crap. And then in the back to be able to then rejoin from 2 and going back down to a single loom. That's like, it doesn't really work. So, unless you can like maybe run your engine sensor criticals on one loom, and then you can have maybe another loom that's for like ignition and it's completely separate, then that can work with like multiple bulkheads. Or the harness will have to be literally thought of and re-strategized from the get-go. And what I mean by that is you start branching things and joining things under boots, so you can get down to that like 61 pin wire count. So if you have, an 8 injector, 8 coil V8 engine that has all these sensors on it, you can eventually start joining 5 volts together and make, 3 5 volts down to 1. And then you can keep going down the path, and you can hide them under your transition boots or your heat shrink or whatever, however you're constructing your harness. So they're hidden, but they're still relatively serviceable, but then they shouldn't necessarily need to be serviced. And then you can get down to like a 61 pin wire count or something more like a typical, and then that kind of turns into a custom loom. So
Yeah.
there's really a fine line. And also, we construct our wiring harnesses with 20 gauge wire for the most part. We don't jump down to 22, because a lot of those more like shelf items, if we can call it that, we don't want the wires to be pulled and broken on the factory connectors. So there's a fine line between wire strength, and there's obviously, you can go a lot smaller when you have a fully shielded, completely sealed, glued boot, versus something that might take some abuse and get pulled out and pulled on. So we try to keep the wires at least like 20 gauge for just the signal sensors, because we want that wire girth to remain strong, so we don't have problems in the future. So we can't really use those Autosport 22 gauge and go all the way up to
79 position or
Yeah.
whatever it might be. A couple of things that are worth noting here that you've just brought up. The wire gauge, and again, this is a question I see come up. What gauge wire should I be using? And
Right.
I think your point there is really, really valid and easy to overlook. So obviously, one of the considerations when we're choosing wire gauge is a current handling capability. So
Exactly.
on a high power device, that's critical. And I mean, give or take a 20 gauge wire, probably get away with about maybe 7 or 8 amps or something. And that's sort of driven by the contact size as well. So of course, the AMP Super Seal connectors, the likes of Motec, Link, Haltech all use, you're limited to a 20 gauge wire anyway. So that's one consideration. However, There's only a handful of instances where we're really worried on our engine wiring about the current handling capability. If we're looking at a throttle position sensor, it's a 5-volt supply, sensor 0 volt, and then the analog voltage output from that sensor back to the ECU. I mean, the current is minuscule, so at that point, the wire gauge in terms of current handling is a non-factor. But as you mentioned, and I think you're only the second person who's actually brought this up, we do need to consider in a non-professional motorsport environment where weight is absolutely not the most critical element that we're considering, the mechanical strength of that wire. So we could easily get away with 24 gauge for a sensor, maybe a map sensor for example. But as you say, if you haven't got professionals working on the car, someone gets a little bit aggressive with a connector body, maybe it hasn't been undone, it's very easy with a 24 gauge wire to actually break the wire. So 20 gauge gives you that nice mechanical strength. The other element I'll just add into the mix there is when we are dealing with OE connector bodies and you're using the contacts that come, the terminals that come with those connector bodies, and normally they'll have a little seal as well for environmental protection. I've personally found those don't work very well once we get down to 22 gauge or below. They really do want a bit of insulation diameter to really actually do their job, correct?
The seal and also the crimp sizes. So, I mean, yeah, you can get like pretty small crimps, but if you're using like 24 gauge wire on the factory style connectors, I mean, as you've seen, 80s, 90s, 2000s, current, the wire crimps are getting smaller and smaller and smaller, right? But if you're doing a lot of stuff from like 2000s era, using that era like Sumitomo, Yazaki, et cetera, brand connectors, they're not really set up to run that small of wire. So you end up having to like get creative with folding wire over itself maybe once or twice to try to actually get like a decent crimp in that crimping zone. And then, like you just said, you have the seal. The seal ends up being baggy on the wire, and then you're not really sealing from the environment. So there's definitely a big reason to go with bigger wire when you're using more factory style connectors. Obviously, if you're in a full motorsport environment where your ECU is all Deutsch Autosports and everything is a fully sealed construction, then you can just go wild and use this thinnest wire that you possibly can. And that works really well too. But let's face it, those clients with that kind of a build is really only going to be like a once a month or once a year potentially for that level of motorsport.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so I think we've probably done your shelf stock harnesses to death at this point. We've probably got a pretty good understanding of what goes into them and how you get that flexibility into them. In terms of your one-offs, what's the sort of requirements for working with Rywire on a one-off harness? Is this a situation where the car needs to be at your shop, or are you able to work from detailed drawings?
So having access is definitely potentially critical depending on the application. So let's face it, man, if you have a Honda and you're doing a K series, I don't care what kind of car you're putting it in. Doesn't matter. I don't need to see your car. We have engines all over the
You've got
place.
this.
I've done every configuration. You can mount it 20 feet away from in the back, hanging out, whatever. It doesn't matter. I'm sure we could figure it out, right? Now, let's take the opposite direction. We just had a client recently that has an Audi, right? It's a really elaborate Audi build. It's running all Cyvex power distribution, Cyvex ECU, really cool stuff. Guy's going to be able to do a lot with this car. And that was something that I visited. So I did a measuring day, sensor placements, and I basically drew up a rough draft, just a line drawing on paper for all my different lengths and breakouts. And then I got a laundry list of all the factory plugs that we're going to be using on it, whether it be a tail light plug or a factory throttle position sensor or something like that. And then we ended up doing a second visit day where I have kind of like a rough draft, maybe only a few of the connectors are actually terminated, kind of lay it over it, see what I like, see what I don't like. Maybe there's sections that need to be strategically lengthened. I mean, heaven forbid you got to lengthen, but sometimes it kind of works out where you can go, I kind of would rather have a Deutsch here anyway, and maybe you can strategize. But I'm not going to be able to nail it 150% because the car's not physically in front of me and the client knows that. So
Yeah.
we dial it all in, everything looks good, works out. And then maybe the third day is a fitting day. And then we'll come back, and then maybe there'll be a fourth day, and that'll be with the engine calibrator. And I'll be able to work with him and strategize and go, I mean, hopefully I would have met with him a little bit before with some IO strategizing and stuff, but we'll, do final fitting and making sure that stuff has power. And then we would potentially fire up the engine and change any IO as we see fit. And that's kind of like our custom jobs. And they're normally end up being about 4 visits. And if the car's at my shop, then cool. But a lot of times with the profile of the cars that we're doing, there's not enough time to just send it to me for a month or weeks at a time. They're trying to do so much to get this car done in a very tight deadline that they need me to just kind of like travel. And thank goodness I'm in Los Angeles, where I can pretty much pick and choose who I want to work with. And that's great. And I mean, as like maybe as bad as that sounds, on the flip side, it's a great position to be in, because I'm not relying on those custom projects to pay the bills. I actually do a lot of those projects with a marketing mindset. So if it's a really good client, the kind of car that I would want to work on, I kind of get to pick and choose what specialty projects that I want to move forward with. That's the really high end stuff. And then we kind of have like the pseudo middle ground, which is kind of what we were talking about with, it's a custom job, but I don't really need to visit, and I can just kind of get it done because we have lengths and stuff like that already determined. At one point, we were doing a bunch of Lamborghini Huracans, and I did one trip and visited and did like all my layouts and measuring. And then I was with an engine calibrator that was really good at wiring and electronics himself. So he was actually able to kind of fine tune my measurements and then report back. And then we ended up doing like a whole run of these cars. Well, they did all the cars and we did all the wiring looms. And that worked out really well because slight adjustments and stuff can be tackled because he could be my eyes and he can report back. And then we can just kind of go back and forth and really dial in those designs and drawings.
So just having someone there that essentially speaks the same language, understands what you're trying to achieve, and can see what changes, if any, may actually help the next iteration be even better for the job.
Exactly.
Now, I haven't obviously dived into your financial situation here, and that's definitely above and beyond the scope of our podcast and what we want to get into. Just in terms of a lot of our listeners, obviously, are home enthusiasts, and then we do have some followers who are looking at starting businesses as well. Am I right in assuming that there is more money to be made or more markup available, I suppose, more margin, I should say, in those shelf stock harnesses where you've gone one time, you've put in the hard work, you've really nutted out what needs to be included, how to make it flexible, like we've said, and then once that's done, you're outsourcing the construction, and as you say, turn 14, send you an email and order 150 of those harnesses, which at that point, I'm guessing for you, is no more work than just sending an email to your supplier and saying, hey, I need 150 of those, versus these one-off harnesses where, I mean, I'm deep in this at the moment with a harness on my FJ40 project car, and it just eats hours and it just keeps on going. Is that a safe assumption? And you sort of mentioned the marketing aspect. I mean, obviously, producing these very high-end, very labor-intensive harnesses is great though for profile. So yeah, am I sort of on the mark with all of that?
Yeah, definitely, 100%. Like if it's something that's gonna, be a very labor intensive project and, we're gonna get paid something, I have to really sit down and think, okay, is this the direction that we want to go? Is this worth it? And you make so many friends that sometimes you have to let some of these friends down because it's like, yeah, I really want to do this for you, but I can't physically fit you into this time slot of being so busy with so many different projects. Another thing too, to kind of put a little bit another layer on it, there's a lot of like private label stuff that we do. So a lot of that stuff I can't really talk about, or I can't like talk about
Of course.
too terribly much, right? Like I'm investing a lot of time right now on an electric project that is with a company that's building multiple units. So we're talking maybe 300 plus in the first vehicle, and then their goal is to be able to do multiple vehicles. and we're going to be using the same components, and all we need to do is just change fitment. So, I mean, think about that from a business perspective. If I can invest, let's say it takes a month or two developing this really inclusive wiring job that, yeah, I could do one off and wire one car. But if I could kind of solidify 300 and then have a projected possibility of doing multiple platforms at 300 wiring looms each, and I have the access to the connectors, and I have access to very good individuals that could build these wiring looms at a, with proper serious testers, and everything's pull tested, and I'm knowing that I'm going to get a proper wiring loom that's going to stand up as good as I can design it, right? So think about that as a business perspective. There's huge opportunity there. So when you do this like one-off project, helping a quote unquote, like helping a friend out, as much as I want to do that, I really have to make wise decisions and go, listen, am I taking away from something that's a huge kind of like almost a would make a huge impact for my business as far as growth, or something that would just be, like a marketing kind of a deal. So there's a fine line.
I think it's just a case of understanding that there is a finite amount of time available in a week in your life, and what you choose to do with that is really important. And I think particularly as you get deeper into business, this becomes more and more obvious. And if you're in a situation, which most of us will be in at some point, where you're doing, for the likes of your one-off project, you are simply trading an hourly rate for your finished product. You can take your hours in the week, your hourly rate, and essentially that's your sort of ceiling on how much you're going to be charging your customer. Absolutely nothing wrong with that, and this is where most of us would start anyway. But there is that ceiling, and then yes, you can get in more staff, but with that comes some complexities as well. And while we're using obviously your wiring situation here as an example, I mean, I would say that this broadly is applicable across the automotive industry, be it mechanical, fabrication, tuning, whatever it happens to be. But then you go and put a month of development and planning into building a product that then you can have someone else replicate 100, 150, 300 times, and all of a sudden you're sort of getting away from trading that time for directly for money. So I mean, I think it's the only way we can ultimately really grow, and it's something that I think is really important for those who are listening and maybe thinking about a career in this industry, just to listen to that last couple of minutes and really get an understanding of that. Because if you can think about this while you're planning your business and how it's going to go, it's going to probably work out a lot better for you. So, and again, kudos to you for basically having both sides of the coin covered. The part I will mention there, which comes down to, I mean, I'm going to guess that obviously you're outworking those production harnesses anyway now, so you don't have to go and sit down and physically make the same product 100 times in a month. I'm going to guess that you get personally a lot more pride, satisfaction, and enjoyment out of making a complex one-off harness where you really have to sit down and figure out some solutions for some tricky problems than it would be sitting down and, all right, well, I'm just going to make my B-series adapter harness here again like I have 100 times already, and you're basically on autopilot, correct?
Yeah, it's a lot more fun and challenging to be pushed a little bit. And I mean, I position myself as that's what I'm doing for the business, is I'm the one that's challenging everyone and helping it grow and market it in a certain way, so yes.
All right. Now, a couple of other things that you mentioned there. The first was the connectors. Again, a really common question we get: how do I find XYZ connector body? Or even going one step beyond this, I've got this sensor, actuator, whatever it may be. How do I know what connector it is? I mean, obviously that's a very open-ended question. Usually some more information is required, but can you give us sort of an understanding of like what an enthusiast can do if they're trying to build a wiring harness and looking for connectors? What are the options available?
Well, just like anything, the more you look at a connector, the more you're going to be better versed with it, right? So like you could start simple and, identify the Deutsch and what's the difference between the DTM, the DT, the DTP, and then all the other kind of more specialty ones that they have. There's certain identifiers, whether it be maybe the terminal lock keyway and go, okay, that's orange. So that's going to be either a DTP or a DTM, right? Like this is very simple because a lot of people do understand the Deutsches for the most part. But then you start stepping into, okay, let's see what brand is that servo or that throttle position sensor. Where's the origin of manufacture? And then you have to start looking into like, is this an 80s Japanese style vehicle? Well, then you start looking at different manufacturers where they use like a Tyco amp stuff for engine computers in that era. Let's just call it the Honda Golden era. And then you have the Yazaki and Sumitomo OE fitted sensors. Like who's making those sensors and where are they being developed? Because Honda's not making the sensor. We have to understand, this is the one thing that we have to really understand as a whole. Everybody's like always confused that, oh, Honda doesn't make a throttle position sensor. Like that's made by, nowadays it could be a Bosch or something like that, right? But it's not the brand that's making the component. Sumitomo, let's say, which is a Japanese plastic molded injected connector company, as well as like tires and everything else they do, they have a series of a connector line. And if there's a catalog, let's say it's 1991 or 1999 or 2016, whatever, they're going to come out with a new series connector for that year range. And what they're bringing each year, maybe every 2 years, they come out with a new series connector. And they may have like a hybrid series that has different terminal sizes. And what you got to do is you got to go on these manufacturers' websites and you got to leaf through the different series connector catalogs, and there's a lot of you could start learning the part numbers and going, okay, well, like going back to Deutsch, you have DT06-8P, and then it's like, okay, that's an 8 position pin because it has the male pin side. And you can kind of like learn their part numbers and kind of understand this is this series, this is this amount of positions, and then this is what you call it, a female, a male, etc. And they go based on the terminal. So a lot of people get that confused with the connectors and they call a pin side a socket side because they look at the housing, but that you have to learn that the manufacturers do it based on the terminal, whether it's a female or a male, right? So as you know, there's a lot of info out there and you just start digging and digging and digging. And then you kind of start discovering all these little things. You're going to be left with a part number. Now, you can't always just get that part number. If it's super new or super old, it could either be not available for customers yet because a company like, let's just keep it simple, Honda may own the right to a certain connector for like a 10-year period. So you might not have access to that on like Tyco's website, for example, for like a 10-year buffer, or it may be a 2-year, but whatever. It could say that it's just not available. And you're like, well, why can't I find this? I know what the part number is. Well, yeah, you know what the part number is, but it's too early for the consumer to purchase. The opposite goes with, let's say, like an 80s series connector. You do some really old Sumitomo HX series connector, and you can identify that as that's the Honda OBD2 99, year distributor connector. I know what it is. I want that plug. Well, sorry, that part number has been discontinued 4 years ago. So then you have to find people that have excess stock, or you have to, in some cases, find an aftermarket solution. Full disclosure, that's how I get all that stuff done.
Yeah, I guess what we're really taking from that is there's no easy solution sometimes, particularly, like you say, if you're dealing with that very old or very new sort of era where the stuff isn't available. Now, in terms of that, if you're trying to do something really new and you've got that licensing issue, are there ways around this? Are there other suppliers, or are you in a situation where maybe you have to resort to potting a particular actuator or sensor and terminating a flying lead with an Autosport or something, or DTM connector or something of that nature?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I kind of try to stay away from factory-based ECUs nowadays, is because you limit yourself, and then you can't build a loom because there maybe is one or two or 100 connectors that just aren't available, right? So yeah, there's been situations where I really wanted to develop an off-the-shelf kind of a part, but I'd be restricted because I can't get some of the connectors. Sometimes you can find some kind of an aftermarket, and that could be a solution. And then you can test the strengths. A lot of times, for example, if it's a male terminal connector, it's going to take a bit more abuse, and it's more easy to just settle for some kind of an aftermarket solution. Also, there's been times where I've been like, okay, I'll build this wiring loom, but I'm not even going to have a connector on it, or I'm just going to leave it a DTM, a Deutsch, and the user can cut their flying lead off and then pin it according to my Deutsch universal drawing, and then they could then have, you know, basically they'd put their input and their old used connector onto my new one, and it'll at least get the job done.
Mm. Yeah, it's important to understand that there are always solutions around these problems, even if you can't get the exact connector body that you're looking for. It'd be nice, but sometimes that's just simply not reality. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about the differences in, that we hear this term thrown around all of the time, mil-spec harnesses, and I think it's something that is very misused these days because there's not a lot of understanding about what it means. And yes, a lot of the components used at the higher levels of professional motorsport may have a military specification, which where that comes from. I tend to think probably a smarter term is professional motorsport or race spec, as we've also heard. So there's that sort of level, which kind of really brings in your custom one-off harnesses. And then more what I refer to as a club level harness. We talked about before your shelf stock harnesses where there's no firewall pass-through connector, for example. So can we talk about some of the differences in terms of the components or materials that are used? Is there a difference in the wiring, the actual conductors, I should say? Is there a difference, in your opinion, in terms of the weight, reliability? What sets these two apart, and why would we choose one over the other?
Right. So for me, it starts with the wire construction. So we would in a mil spec or pseudo motorsport junior level, club level, whatever you choose to call it, something that has that M22759 wire in it, so that aviation quality mil, quote unquote, mil spec part number. That, to me, if somebody's going to call something a mil spec harness, they better have at least that M22759, and you can Google that and kind of start digging into what that all means. But for me, that's really the ground point of what a motorsport wire loom needs to have. One of the reasons why is because when you start using these, Amphenol Deutsch motorsport style bulkhead mil spec or autosport connectors, you really shouldn't be using any lower grade wire than that for the service looping strategy, inserting the wires. All these things don't really work very well when you start using a lower quality wire like a TXL automotive style wire. You need something with the strength and the jacketing of this thin sleeving to be able to actually insert and install that.
I'll just sort of jump in here because obviously some of our listeners may not kind of understand those terminologies. So that wire you're talking about with the mil specification, that's often referred to as TFSL wire. And if we can't obviously show this, but side by side with TXL, I mean, for the same gauge of actual conductor, it can handle the same current, but the jacketing, the insulation on the TXL is probably about double the diameter. So where that becomes a problem is you actually wouldn't be able to pin out an Autosport connector using TXL. It's not designed for that thicker insulation. It won't work.
Right. Even if you use the right size size wire that physically fits the pin, the next constraint would be that jacketing is just too large to fit into that insulated hole, right? I mean, it's just like life. Everything works together to have the proper highest level solution. So you're starting at wire. The wire needs to be set for those connectors. And then the loom on top of that wire is, more of a heat shrink instead of like a braided loom. So obviously the most popular is your Raycam, or there's some other like Sumi Tube and things like that that are popular and still work. But yeah, some kind of a heat shrinkable option is going to be when with your more like club or motorsport level wiring construction. And then to take it a step further, the actual architecture of the wire and then the twisting strategy. As we've talked about in the past, and like I'm sure people have seen this, is that the reason for that twist is for a strain relief. Because if you hold two wires next to each other and you pull on one side, if they're just parallel from each other, you pull on one side, you're going to create a bind on one strand, and then the other one's going to get a pull. But if it's twisted, no matter what direction you lay those wires down, it's going to be a strain relieved lay.
So essentially, no individual conductor is ever going to be placed under any more stress or strain than any other.
Correct.
Obviously, it comes at a deficit in terms of the time required to actually construct that concentrically twisted harness.
Exactly.
It's a little bit more involved, let's be honest.
Yep.
Okay, so in terms of the functionality, I mean, obviously, any harness properly constructed is going to get electrical signals from point A to point B with a good level of reliability. But where, if you were a salesman for the professional level harness, what would you say its main sort of selling points are over a lower grade harness?
I think weight is one factor, which isn't a huge one, but it's one of them, definitely. The size and bulk of the loom is a big one. Being able to implement things like a bulkhead connector, where you really can't do it properly if you're using a lower grade wire, which in turn, just like what I said before, one thing leads to another. So if you're okay with grommeted factory style situations, bulkheading through, and factory style connectors for the most part, then a factory new wiring loom could be perfectly fine for you. But if you're searching aftermarket sensors, you have a different engine computer, I think that these are all things that you should definitely consider a higher level, more of a sculpted, well thought out motorsport level wiring loom.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think what's important is to understand that every project is different and every project has a set of requirements, and of course at the same time has a budget associated with it. And I think it's easy for those who are maybe up and coming as enthusiasts looking at building a project car to scroll Instagram and see all of these cars with immaculate mil-spec harnesses and think that this is the only way they can go. But, I mean, if it's the difference between, particularly for a street car, if it's the difference between getting the project finished or having to wait another 12 months to save up the funds to do a higher level harness, well, it's not reasonable to say that every harness should be a mil-spec harness. It's horses for courses. At the upper levels of professional motorsport, you're probably not going to see anything else, and that makes sense. I mean, the budget's there. They want the lowest weight. They want the ultimate reliability, and at that level as well, the downside of a reliability issue being stranded on the side of the track, not making the starting grid, I mean, that could cost a professional race team, thousands and thousands of dollars in terms of what it costs them to get to a race meeting in the first place, never to compete. That's not really an issue if maybe it's your daily driver. I mean, no one wants an unreliable daily driver. But yeah, these are the sort of things I think people do need to weigh up. And as I say, horses for courses, depending on what you're actually trying to achieve. Look, I'm interested, Ryan, as well, obviously over a long career building wiring harnesses and seeing the results of poorly constructed wiring harnesses. Is there anything that jumps out as a common mistake or oversight you have seen in your career?
Yeah, I think that for me, because we are, dealing with that more club level client every day, and then the more motorsport client a little bit less often. The club level, like the guy that has a couple builds under their belt and they're like, I'm going to run a standalone computer this time around. There's a lot of issues I see with just not being as well versed with the components that they may have or the components that they need. And that's like one of our biggest struggles is we try very hard to explain to our clients what all these different sensors mean and systems are able to do and why you need them. And there's a lot of disconnect there where, a client will say, hey, this relay is bad on your wiring harness. I need a new relay. But then you're like, well, why do you need it? This is just an example like from today. Well, why do you think that you need a new relay? Oh, well, because I'm not getting power to the engine computer. Okay, well, that relay actually isn't to power the engine computer. So the first step would be to power the engine computer, and then we can find out if that relay for your wideband sensor is good or not. So there's like a disconnect of people not even really knowing what they're looking at, and I think that's honestly, like, as simple as that sounds, there's a big problem. And I think more people just need to take the HPA courses and just learn all the basics.
Yeah, I was literally just going to say there. I mean, that sounds more like what you're describing as a lack of just the basic fundamentals of automotive wiring and how circuits work, and for the most part there as well how a relay works. And I would 100% agree. I think that is a missing link out there in the industry in general. And I think that EFI Wiring Fundamentals course that we offer, not as a sales pitch here, but
no, you need to take it.
Even if someone has no intention of ever building a harness from start to finish, that course is, I believe, essential knowledge for anyone who is an automotive enthusiast. And the reason I'll say that is because just in terms of fault finding, understanding how a particular circuit or a relay works, or a sensor and actuator, once you understand it, it's very easy to then go through the diagnostics process and troubleshoot. And while we'd like to think that all of our projects will just go smoothly from start to finish, I mean, that unfortunately is just not the case. So I think it's really valuable to have those skills. And in the same vein, I've always a big advocate for those who are interested in tuning, having both those fundamentals of wiring for the reasons I've just mentioned, but also the fundamentals of the mechanical operation of an engine, because you cannot fix every problem with the laptop keyboard, and sometimes you actually need to understand the cues that you're getting and what that means mechanically is something is not quite right there. So thank you for mentioning that. Look, Ryan, I think we'll move towards wrapping this one up. We are getting a little bit short on time. I'm sure I could probably go for another hour on all of your various projects, but we're just a little bit short on time. We've got the same 3 questions we like to ask all of our guests at the end of our podcasts, and I'm going to throw those at you now. So the first of those is, what's next in the future for you and for Rywire?
Well, I think that just keeping on, just doing these wiring harnesses until there's no more left to do is definitely one piece of it. I think that moving forward in kind of the EV space is kind of interesting to me, because I feel like when you do something all day, every day for a very long extended period of time, and the internal combustion engine, there's still a lot more growth and a lot of stuff that can potentially keep, growing with that. I want to kind of jump ahead and challenge myself, right? So this electric, uprise with all these OEs and everybody's going electric, I really want to be on the forefront of all that. So just learning these components, realizing actually how much tuning and strategy and all the little fine minuscule details that are involved in a proper EV, like a proper runner, it's quite complicated, and it's actually really exciting for me. So even though maybe like they're not the most fun cars to drive, they're maybe right now they're kind of looked down upon, I think that there's a huge opportunity just in a learning space, because there's not a whole lot of information available and like classes, hint hint, Andre. But like just the electric world is very, it's too soon, right? But this is the perfect time for me to start learning and getting my hands dirty in it and really like bettering myself with it. So I see a lot of opportunity with EV, also with the private label stuff. So just trying to better other people's brands by offering them something that they're not as competent with. And I can take the reins and I can actually design things and forecast things that they would maybe never have even been able to pick up on because they just haven't been doing it for 20 plus years like I have.
I'll just focus briefly on the EV side of things because I think I'm in exactly the same position as you, as how I see that EV market. It's coming fast, and it's not going to be too long before there is a growing enthusiast market for EV solutions. And I mean, I don't know if boring is the right way to explain EV, because I just watched that, I can't even remember the name of it.
I already know what you're going to say.
Electric rocket just destroyed Nick Heidfeld's F1 time up the Goodwood Festival of Speed driveway. And it looks like it was a video played at 2 times speed. The thing is insane.
Yeah.
So, yeah, some very exciting technology there.
Yep.
Yeah. So, I mean, watch this space. Obviously, there's opportunity there. Next question for you, Ryan. Is there any advice you'd give to a younger version of yourself based on the experience you've had in your career to date? Maybe our listeners who are maybe looking at starting a business in the wiring space or the automotive space in general, any advice you'd give to sort of fast track your career where you've got to?
I guess the one little piece of advice, because I feel like I've done pretty good as far as just my organic growth and not trying to like I already like almost kill myself on a daily basis, just like with stretching myself thin. So I think I'm like riding that fine line, and we don't have upset customers, so it's great. I'm just like riding that wave. But I really wish that I was able to kind of see, as funny as it sounds, YouTube as like a little bit more of a tool rather than something where I just saw early on as, oh, these kids just posting up these stupid things. And like there's a huge market there, and there's definitely a lot of lost opportunity, or there is opportunity that I still haven't been able to achieve yet there. So
you're talking about
earlier,
using YouTube as a means of promoting your product and getting people to know about your product.
Everything. I mean, from making a video to just describe how something works, like, kind of like more or less what you guys are, that direction of things, like this is how it works and this is why you need to use it, all the way to, like I've been doing a little bit, like this is how you order a wiring harness, or this is me installing it, or this is a high level car and look at what we're doing, or here's a finished build, or even some of the YouTube quote unquote celebrities with opportunities that I maybe have missed out on. Like there's so much to unpack with YouTube, but that's just, answering that question directly. Probably one of the biggest look back in hindsights is YouTube.
Taking more advantage of it. And I mean, I think we have to continue to watch the evolution of social media platforms in terms of what they bring to the table and where you can leverage those. I mean, obviously, we've seen over the last couple of years, TikTok has exploded as well. So it's something that we at HPA sort of decided that we needed to be involved with. Obviously, everything takes time as well. And, if you're one person or a small team, it's difficult to do justice to every platform. So sometimes you do have to decide what you're going to prioritize. All right, Ryan, last question for today. If people want to find out more about you, follow your journey, where are they best to do that? What are your social media accounts or website?
Yeah, website is rywire.com. If you have emails and whatnot, just that's probably the best place to get a hold of me with questions. Email is kind of a hack, so I try to answer most of them. So if you want to talk to me, then email is probably the best starting point. Instagram is Rywire_motorsport_electronics. Quite long, but that's because I haven't been able to get a hold of that Rywire account yet. And then on YouTube, it's just at Rywire. So, I mean, it's a smaller channel, but we are starting to grow that a bit, and we have a lot of ideas in the making for that. So, definitely check me out there as well.
Perfect. Well, we'll put some links to those in the show notes as well so people can check them out there. Look, Ryan, been great to chat, great to sort of get a bit more of an understanding on what Rywire is and where it came from. So really appreciate your time today, and hopefully your journey and everything you've shared with us will be inspirational to those who are listening.
Yeah, thank you, man. It's good to see you again, Andre, and hopefully I get to see you again soon.
If you enjoyed this episode of Tuned In with Ryan from Rywire, we'd love it if you could drop us a review on your chosen podcasting platform. These reviews really help us to grow our audience, and that in turn helps us to continue to get bigger and better guests. To say thanks, each week we'll be picking a random reviewer and sending them out an HPA t-shirt anywhere in the world. This is also a great place to ask any questions you might have. I'll do my best to answer them if your review gets picked. So this week, a big shout out to Stephen Thomas, who's said, "Cheers for the podcast. Did anyone else see Cletus McFarlane spray nitrous directly onto their twin turbos on their drag cart mullet? I wonder how much of that was creating an increase of power, therefore spooling the turbos quicker, or was the nitrous being sprayed onto the turbine wheel literally making it spin faster? Either way it works, but not an ideal safe setup. Any thoughts?" Well, I think I'd probably echo the last part of that. Definitely not something that I would say is safe or anything that you could do outside of a dyno cell, perhaps producing a YouTube video. And no doubt that was probably the main intention there. Ultimately, no matter where you're spraying the nitrous, as long as it's getting into the engine, it will have the effect of increasing the oxygen content inside of the combustion chamber, add more fuel to go with that extra oxygen, and we make more power. I would guess here that there probably is a benefit of also spooling the turbos up quicker if you're spraying that directly into the compressor wheel, but I'm sorry, without some back-to-back testing, I couldn't really tell you much more. Again, not something I could strictly recommend for a reliable or safe way of introducing nitrous. Anyway, thanks for your comment there, Stephen. Get in touch with your t-shirt size and shipping details, and we'll fire off a fresh tee straight out to you. All right, that concludes our interview. And before we sign off, I just wanted to mention, for anyone who's been perhaps hiding under a rock and hasn't heard of High Performance Academy before, we are an online training school, and we specialize in teaching a range of performance automotive topics, everything from engine tuning and engine building through to wiring, car suspension and wheel alignment, data analysis, and race driver education. Now, remember, you've got that coupon code. You can use podcast75 at the checkout to get $75 off the purchase of your first course. You'll find our full course list at hpaacademy.com/courses. Important to mention that when you purchase a course from us, that course is yours for life as well. It never expires. You can rewatch the course as many times as you like, whenever you like. The purchase of a course will also give you 3 months of access to our gold membership. That gives you access to our private members only forum, which is the perfect place to get answers to your specific questions. You'll also get access to our regular weekly members webinars, which is where we touch on a particular topic in the performance automotive realm. We dive into that topic for about an hour. If you can watch live, you can ask questions and get answers in real time. If the time zones don't work for you, that's fine too. You're going to get access as a gold member to our previous webinar archive. We've got close to 300 hours of existing content in that archive. It is an absolute goldmine. So remember that coupon code podcast75. Check out our course list at hpaacademy.com/courses.